Okay. We saw from Shlishi, that's Perikut Lamed Hey, Posuk Lamed. Yom Moshe al Bnei Yisrael, Ru'u, Korah Hashem b'Shem Betzalel. You should see that Hashem had called by name Betzalel, ben Uri ben Chur Lamati Yehuda. First, what is the expression, you should see? Meaning, it's with absolute clarity. You see for yourselves that Betzalel is the only one who's qualified to be in this position. So there's no question that it's God's pick. Betzalel was God's pick, as I'll tell you in a moment. B'Shem Betzalel ben Uri ben Chur Lamati Yehuda. There's a midrash. The midrash tells us when Hashem was in Shamayim, in heaven, this is before he brought down the second set of tablets. The last 40-day period, Hashem communicates to Moshe that you're going to have to build a Mishkan. And you will do this and you'll do that. You will make the Oron, you will make the Shulchan, you will make the Mizbeach, all the various components of the Mishkan. And when he finally tells him, you will do everything, he says, and who will oversee the Mishkan, the building of the Mishkan? Because Moshe himself had thought, if God says you will do this and you will do that, evidently he'll be the one, and seemingly he should be the most qualified to oversee the building of the Mishkan. So Hashem says to Moshe, no, it's Betzalel ben Uri ben Chur Lamati Yehuda. It's your great nephew, the grandson of Chur, who was the son of Miriam. But Moshe originally had believed it would be him. He'd be the one. Seemingly, he's the most qualified. No one understands the inner workings of existence as Moshe does. Nevertheless, he says, no, Betzalel is the one. Okay? So there's a famous word from the Orach Chaim HaKadosh. If in fact, Moshe was not the one meant to oversee every aspect of the Mishkan, that was not his responsibility. Why, regarding the charge of making the Oron, the Shulchan, the Golden Table, and the Mizbeach, why does it say, Moshe, always in singular, Moshe, you do this and you do that? So the Orach Chaim explains that, firstly, we find that Moshe did not participate in the building of the Mishkan. We mentioned this yesterday. Why did he not participate in the building of the Mishkan? Because he had said that I don't want to deny any Jew his right to participate. And maybe if I participate, I may deny some Jew that there won't be anything for him to do. So I will wait till they all do what they have to do. And if there's any shortfall, I'll come in and I'll make up what the shortfall may be. So ultimately, Moshe Rabbeinu was not involved in the building of the Mishkan, because by the time he came to be involved, everything was completed. So Hashem says to Moshe, your participation will be greater than theirs, because although they made the Mishkan, you will have Hakomas HaMishkan. You will erect the Mishkan, because the Mishkan physically was so heavy, without a miracle, it was impossible to raise the Mishkan. The beams, they were too heavy, and to construct it and put it together. And therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, although you didn't participate in the Binyan HaMishkan, the Hakomas HaMishkan, the raising of the Mishkan, to raise the beams, that will be you. That's what Hashem says to Moshe. So if that's the case, what does it mean? Hashem says to Moshe, you do A, B, C, D, you make it. So he explains that Hashem wanted Moshe to have the schus, the merit, that every aspect of the Mishkan should be the equivalent as if he did do it. How is that? Because since we have a principle of shlich shalom kamoso, that when one appoints an agent, the agent stands in the stead of the person who appointed him. So although Moshe didn't do the actual building of the Mishkan, the goldsmithing, the weaving, the dyeing, or whatever may have been, the cabinetry making, nevertheless, it's attributed to him because every Jew who participated in the Mishkan was the equivalent of Moshe Shaliach, who's like Moshe's agent. And based on the principle of Shlich Shalom Kamoso, it's as if Moshe had actually was involved in every aspect of the Mishkan. Because Hashem wanted Moshe should have that schus. This is the Orach Chaim HaKodesh. So initially, although Moshe was most qualified, but Hashem wanted Moshe to have that schus. So if that's the case, why was Moshe upset? Moshe was like disappointed that there was nothing left for him to do. If every Jew doing is the equivalent of him doing, because every Jew is a shliach, so why was Moshe disappointed that he should not be involved in the building of the Mishkan? He was. Every aspect of Mishkan was his, based on the principle of shlich shalom kamoso. That's the question I asked. So the understanding, the correct understanding is, because the Gemara tells us in Kedushin that although shlich shalom kamoso, mitzvah bo yosef b'shlucho, if one is able to delegate something through an agent, and you're able to do it yourself, it's better to do it yourself. Because the agent, although it's attributed to you, it's equivalent of arm's length. But if you do it yourself, you're involved in yourself, it's another level. So Moshe, although the Mishkan is attributed to him based on this principle of agency, but since factually he was not involved in the direct development of the Mishkan, that's why he was disappointed and that he didn't have the schus to be directly involved. This is even with the Orach Chaim HaKodesh. That's the reason why he was disappointed. But factually, he says Betzalel will oversee the Mishkan. Now, how do we understand why Betzalel? Moshe believed it would be him, and he was the most qualified. Who was the most qualified to be the Kohen Gadol, the high priest? Moshe. Yet Moshe was not chosen to be the Kohen Gadol. Why? Because of what happened at the burning bush, at the Sneh. Because initially Moshe was meant to be the Kohen Gadol, the Kohen, but because after being involved in a dialogue for 7 days, after 7 days, and Hashem had answered and responded to every one of his questions, why he was not qualified, and after he says, but why don't you send Aaron, who's been your prophet all these years, as your spokesman, Hashem says, you've already overstepped your bounds. Until now, Aaron was meant to be the Levi. From going forward, he will no longer be the Levi, you'll be the Levi. At that moment, he forfeited the right to the Kuna, because that was considered a disrespect. So there we understand. But overseeing the Mishkan, seemingly, Moshe was the most qualified. So why? And that's why Moshe initially had believed that it would be him. So after being told, you will do this, you will do that, and as we explained now, according to the Orach Chaim HaKodesh, it means agency. Afterwards, he understood that. So if that's the case, but why wasn't he chosen to oversee the actual building of the Mishkan, overseeing all the artisans who were involved in developing and creating whatever they created? So that we need the other Chazal. Over here, when we trace the pedigree of Betzalel, it's Betzalel ben Uri ben Chur Lamata Yehuda. Why are we tracing his pedigree 2 generations? It's enough to say Betzalel ben Uri. We always trace it 1 generation. Why are we going back to the grandfather? Now, who was Chur? Chur was the nephew of Moshe and Aaron. The last mention of him, of Chur, was what? At the time of the Egel, right before the Egel. What happened to Chur? Chur, when the rabble introduced the idea that since Moshe Rabbeinu is no longer here, we're going to create a golden calf, Chur interceded, protested, and Chur was killed. Chur was killed by the Erev Rav. And that's why Aaron, when he saw that he was killed, he got involved to delay, because Aaron was concerned that if they would kill him, since he was a Kohen and Navi, if one kills a Kohen Novi, it's unforgivable. And didn't want to put Klaus in that position that if they cross that line, they'll never be forgiven. But he only understood that to what degree, to what extent they would go, only after he saw his nephew. They murdered his nephew. Chur was the first Jew ever to die as a Jew, al Kiddush Hashem. He was murdered al Kiddush Hashem because he tried to prevent, he protested the idolatry. So he died al Kiddush Hashem. Hashem says, what is it analogous to? And this I mentioned in the Medrash in the past. You have a general who won many battles for the king and brought much glory to the king. And the king decides that when this general comes back from the next battle, he will reward him handsomely. One of a kind of a reward. What happens? The general is killed in battle, he doesn't return. So what does he do? But he feels he has this debt of payment to the family, so he goes and seeks out a family member and he finds the grandchild. And he gives the grandchild that gift of appreciation for what he feels he owed the grandfather. Betzalel, although he was 13 years old at this time, he was only 13, he was endowed with wisdom, with insight, and divine understanding because he was not the son of Uri, but because he was the grandson of Chur. Because he was the grandson of Chur, that's the reason why he was chosen. Because this is Hashem paying his debt, not that Hashem's a debtor, to Chur, by choosing his grandchild, Betzalel, and Betzalel is Betzel Kael. He was in the shadow of God, meaning he was endowed with endowments, which was one of a kind, and therefore he was able to oversee the building of the Mishkan. That's how Moshe Rabbeinu understood. He thought it'd be him. So it's not because Moshe had failed on his watch, but rather because Betzalel was chosen, because Chur had to be rewarded. Therefore, Betzalel was chosen to oversee the Mishkan. Okay? So Moshe understands this. He comes down from the mount with the second luchos, second set of tablets, and he says to Klal Yisrael, because you failed with the Egel, we must make a Mishkan. So the first question they ask Moshe Rabbeinu is what? Who's going to oversee the Mishkan? That's the first question they ask him. So he answers them, Betzalel ben Uri ben Chur l'mat Yehuda. That's what he says to the Klal Yisrael. Immediately, there are murmurings. Of course, this whole situation here is nepotism. Why? His brother's the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. He's the king. His brother's the Kohen Gadol. His brother's children are assistant Kohanim. They assist their father. And now he's choosing his great nephew to oversee the Mishkan. It's a family affair. This is the murmurings which are going on. Moshe responds. He says, you don't understand. To be qualified to oversee the Mishkan, you have to have chokhmah and bina, and you have to have das. You have a certain degree of wisdom, you have to have insight, and you have to be divinely inspired. Anything less than that, you're not qualified. You have to understand the inner workings of creation. So when they heard that, they said, you know something? Now we understand beyond doubt that the only one who's qualified in this position is only Betzalel. But initially, there were murmurings. They questioned him. Only after Moshe responded by explaining him what the qualifications are, Chochmah, Bin, and Das, they said, oh, now we understand. So I'm saying the pasuk uses Ru'u. Moshe said to Bnei Yisrael, Ru'u. What's Ru'u mean? See. Seeing is absolute. We're talking about clarity, understanding beyond any doubt that Betzalel is the one, because they question, did Hashem really say it, or this is your choice? So he said, Ru'u, by telling them, explaining to them what the qualifications were needed. Therefore, it's Ru'u. Now you seek without, beyond any doubt, that it was Hashem who was Koro, B'Shem Betzalel ben Uri ben Chur l'mat Yehuda. I mean, if Moshe would have said, I'm the one who's doing it, they wouldn't have questioned Moshe. Everybody agrees. He's the most qualified to oversee the Mishkan. But Betzalel, a 13-year-old child, the answer is because it's your great nephew. On that, he said no. Ru'u Kora Hashem. It's God made this choice. proof in the pudding is that he has an endowment which is impossible unless God directly endowed him with these endowments. Therefore, now that they see that, seeing means with absolute clarity, they no longer have a question that the most qualified is Betzalel, and this choice is not based on nepotism. But what I pointed out was something like unbelievable. What is the background on this? What's Moshe Rabbeinu's track record in regard to Klal Yisrael? After he's shown and proven himself and gone to the nth degree on their behalf to do what's best for them, they question. He's bringing down the second set of luchos, which is a reinstatement. He spent 3 40-day periods in heaven, first to receive the first set of luchos. Then they sinned with golden calf. He went to supplicate Hashem. They should be forgiven, not destroyed. The third 40 days is they should be reinstated. He comes down with the luchos. And this is besides what preceded. The splitting of the sea, the 10 plagues, everything under the sun. And after doing all this, and they ask, and who's going to build the Mishkan? Betzalel. The murmurings. And not only that, when he came down with the second set of tablets, what did we read in last week's parsha? He had a radiance of holiness that the Jews couldn't look at him. He had to wear a mask. That would indicate to what degree he was holy. So you mean this holy man that you can't look at, which is clearly, he's imbued with the level of holiness of God. It's nepotism. It's not God, but it's you. I mean, is this to be understood? But yet, unless they understood on their own turf, on their own understanding that Betzalel is the only one qualified, only then they said, Moshe, now we see and understand that it's God chose him, because nobody's at the level of Betzalel, he's the most qualified. Just a point, you think about it, and it's something, and therefore, as a result of this, Korach later, when he came with his accusation that this is nepotism, when he chose his a cousin to be the prince of the Levium, again he said, Elitzov ben Uziel, because Korach felt he was the most qualified, again he says, it's nepotism. So Korach understood exactly where things were at, that the moment Moshe loses his popularity, he's going for the jugular vein, and he did. And the card he played was exactly when he saw the weakness in the Jews' belief, where was Moshe coming from, that Moshe could be accused of nepotism, and the only reason why it's not is because they have to understand on their own accord. And if not, then you're able to launch your mutiny, and that's what Korach did. Okay, Elise's asking a question. If the only way the Mishkan could be raised was only through a miracle, so after Moshe Rabbeinu raised it and he erected it, ongoing, Moshe didn't do it. The Jews themselves did it. So was it always a miracle? Now, we find that Yocheved was the daughter of Levi, and she was born as Yaakov came with his family through the walls of Egypt. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu was born 80 years before the Jews left Egypt. So how old was Yocheved when she gave birth?
137.
137. How's it 137?
You're going on the point that already Sarah Menu gave birth.
That's the point I'm making. That exactly is the point I'm making. Right.
She was 137, I think, when she gave birth.
No, she was 130 years old. Okay. She was 130 years old when she gave birth. Right? The Jews lived with her 210. 80. So Moshe was 80 when he took us out of Egypt. With Sari Menu, she was 90. She conceived when she was 89. She gave birth when she was 90. Torah makes a whole issue of it. That was a miracle. The angels came and told her this and that. Yocheved is 130 years old when she gives birth to Moshe Rabbeinu. Torah made silent on this. How's it possible? Right? Torah doesn't make a big issue of it. So the answer which is given, that once there was that change in nature, Until Sari Menu, no one ever gave birth at that age, unless it was pre-flood, when people lived till 900 years old. So a woman 80 years old was considered a young woman, or 90 years, that's a young woman. You were considered a youth first at the age of 100. That was adolescence, 100. But post-flood, a woman who's 89 years old doesn't conceive any longer. So if that's the case, it's miraculous. Once Hashem allowed that miracle to exist within nature, to repeat it, it's not something astounding any longer. It's within the tool chest that when it's needed, it can happen. It didn't have to be a new creation, didn't have to be innovated to allow that to come about. Therefore, the Torah is making an issue when Yocheved conceived Moshe at the age of 129 and gave birth to him at the age of 130 for that reason. Initially, it was impossible to raise the Mishkan. The beams were too heavy. The Jews tried, they couldn't. But why did Hashem perform the miracle on behalf of the Jews? Because Hashem wanted Moshe Rabbeinu should have the schus, the merit, that the Mishkan ultimately should begin functioning as a result of his erecting the Mishkan. Hashem didn't want the Jews to do that. They would have done it if they could have. So Hashem would not perform that miracle on their behalf. But once it was done through Moshe Rabbeinu, this becomes natural now. They were able to erase the beams, that becomes natural. Once Moshe Rabbeinu did it, okay? So I asked a question, which is an obvious question. If any of us would write a Sefer Torah, Ernie, Mark, Alan, Jay, each one of them use a different thing. If Ernie, Mark, or Jay, or Alan could have Moshe Rabbeinu writing a letter in their Sefer Torah, would you forget about Moshe Rabbeinu and not have him insert a letter in the Sefer Torah? It's unheard of. The Mishkan is built by every person. So nobody knows what's going on by anyone else. Everybody thinks maybe Moshe Rabbeinu is also participating. Everybody finally brings all the components of the Mishkan ready to raise the beams. They tried to raise it themselves. Where's Moshe? How do you not include Moshe Rabbeinu in the raising of in erecting the Mishkan? If they could have, they would have done it themselves, but Hashem didn't allow it, would not perform the miracle, because Hashem wanted Moshe should be the one to erect the Mishkan, not them. But the question is, how do you forget about Moshe Rabbeinu? Right? It's mind-boggling. Could you imagine Jay writing a Sefer Torah and forget about Rabbi Pinto? He'd bring him in from Israel, Paris, wherever he is, from Morocco. They should put a letter in the Sefer Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu, how do you forget about him? This question always bothered me. And yet we find there's not even a claim against Klal Yisrael. How do you leave out Moshe Rabbeinu? Hashem had to not allow a miracle to take place to guarantee that Moshe is the one to erect the Mishkan. I think it's a simple question, an obvious question. Obvious if you think about it. Okay? So what I said was, this is considered something which is admirable that they didn't think about Moshe Rabbeinu. We find that the Nesiim, the princes, were faulted because they delayed. Because this kind of opportunity to be involved in the building of the Mishkan, as we said, based on the principle of Ha'ava Mekalkel Zashura, that if a person is imbued and consumed with love, you can't make calculations. You're there immediately. How did the Nesiim make a calculation to say, well, let them do what they want to do, and then we, whatever's the shortfall is, we'll complete the shortfall. And what was? They were nearly left out. The Jews nearly did everything. And due to their laid-backness, therefore, they're faulted and openly reprimanded because that when they're mentioned, the spelling of Nesiim is written in a deleted form. The Yud is not there. Right? That's what we said. So what's the fault? Because if you would have appreciated what it means to build a Mishkan, that Hashem is re-entering into your midst, if you would have fully internalized that, it's impossible to make a calculation. You're there before yesterday. That's how quickly you're there. And therefore, because they weren't, therefore it's a claim. Klal Yisrael was so subsumed and consumed with Hashem re-entering to their midst, they couldn't make a calculation. Where's Moshe? Nobody thought about Moshe Rabbeinu. But the not finger Moshe is not a claim against them, because that was only an indication to what degree they were so libo, that every Jew was at that level that they wanted the Mishkan to be immediately, so the Shekhinah should re-enter into our midst. That's why I didn't think about Moshe Rabbeinu. It was because of the desire to reconnect at that special level. But factually, Hashem says, it's admirable. You accredited for that, but you can't compare you erecting the Mishkan and Moshe erecting the Mishkan. Therefore, for that you need a miracle. For you, I'm not going to perform that miracle, but for Moshe Rabbeinu, I will, because I want him. He should be the one to erect the Mishkan. For that reason.